The air in my apartment that Tuesday afternoon was thick, heavy like humidity before a summer storm. But this pressure wasn't atmospheric. It was built over 15 years of meticulously constructed lies. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white, staring out the window at the indifferent city traffic, and trying to process the words my mother had just spat out like poison ivy.
And he's calling me crazy. You know what's crazy? Dropping dead of an overdose on a family vacation. It was the casualness of it that hit me first. Like she was reciting a grocery list, not detonating my entire childhood understanding of reality. Dropping dead, overdose, vacation. These words shouldn't ever occupy the same sentence as the memory of my father. For 15 years, I've carried a hollow space where certainty should be. 15 years of rehearsing a painful, vague answer for everyone who asked the dreaded question, "How did your dad die?" My script was always the same, delivered with a practiced, brittle smile. It was inconclusive. The doctors couldn't quite figure it out. And in that simple word, inconclusive, I found a strange, terrible peace. It meant randomness. It meant tragedy that couldn't be pinned down, couldn't be blamed on a specific vice or a lapse in judgment. It was just fate. But fate, it turned out, wore a mask of denial, and the person holding that mask was the very woman who had supposedly dedicated her life to radical honesty. My parents' house, growing up, wasn't a place of secrets, at least not the conventional kind. We talked about everything. I mean everything. My mum was an open book about her own struggles, her past with substances, the mistakes she'd made. She'd shared things with me, her daughter, that most parents keep locked away until therapy sessions decades later. She prided herself on that transparency. It was the foundation of our bizarrely modern, sometimes uncomfortable, but always honest family unit. So when it came to my dad, when I, a gawky, overly perceptive 13-year-old, pressed her about the gaping hole he left, her wall went up hard. It was his heart, honey, a sudden failure. The details are too complicated, too messy. Let's just remember him how he was, okay? She'd said, her voice firm, eyes unwavering. And because she was the authority, the keeper of the truth, I believed her. I had to believe her, because the alternative, the possibility that the man I idealized, the man whose ghost was a constant, silent presence, was taken by the very thing my mother admitted she fought daily, that was too terrifying to process at 13. So I shelved the suspicion, tucked it away, and accepted the inconclusive ending. Now, at 22, I'm supposed to be navigating adult life, career choices, independence, figuring out the world. Instead, I was being forced back into the wreckage of my childhood, reeling from a casual slip of the tongue during a minor argument about my younger brother. My brother, Leo. He's 17 now, full of that chaotic teenage energy, and he and Mum have been clashing constantly since I moved out. They're both strong-willed, and lately, the tension has been palpable over the phone. She calls me to vent, which is normal, but this time the venting turned into a confession disguised as an attack. "He's calling me crazy," she'd sighed, the phone line crackling with static and old resentment. "You know what's crazy? Dropping dead of an overdose on a family vacation." The world tilted. The colours in my apartment seemed to dull instantly. The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving a searing vacuum. Overdose. The word echoed in the sudden, profound silence on my end. I remember asking, my voice thin, unrecognisable, "Mom, what did you just say?" She must have realised it immediately. The silence that followed wasn't filled by static, it was filled by the sound of 15 years of certainty collapsing. I could practically hear her scrambling for the cover-up, the backtrack, but it was too late. The foundation had cracked wide open. "Nothing, sweetie, I misspoke. I meant his heart attack was stress-related. You know how much he drank." But I knew. I knew that wasn't what she said. The sheer weight of the lie she'd maintained, not just to me, but to the entire extended family, settled on my shoulders. It wasn't just the truth about my father, it was the betrayal of her supposed commitment to honesty. If she could lie about the fundamental way I lost my parent, what else had been curated, edited, or outright fabricated? I couldn't stand to hear her voice anymore. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I did something much colder, much more final for that moment. I hung up. The soft click of the phone ending the call felt deafeningly loud in the sudden vacuum of sound. My hands were shaking violently. I didn't know who to call or what to say, but I knew I needed grounding, perspective that wasn't tainted by my mother's immediate, panicked damage control. There was only one person who might understand the depth of this inherited mess. The person who saw my parents' flaws long before I did. My maternal grandmother, Nana Rose. I dialed her number, my thumb hovering over the screen. Nana Rose is my anchor. She's the keeper of the family law, the one who remembers the before times. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hello, darling girl. Are you eating enough? You sound breathless." I stumbled through the story, trying to remain coherent, while my internal monologue screamed obscenities at my mother. I told Nana about the phone call, the exact words, the immediate retraction, the sheer shock of knowing the truth, that my father, the man who battled addiction, died because of it, on a trip meant to be a happy respite for our family. Nana listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, breathless and tearful, I waited for the inevitable defense of her daughter. I waited for the deflection. Instead, she sighed, a long, weary sound that carried the weight of decades. "Oh, honey, I was afraid this day would come." That acknowledgement, the knowing, was almost worse than the original confession. "Why?" I choked out, the question tearing from my throat. Why did she lie to me for 15 years? If we were supposed to be honest about everything, why was this the one thing she hid? Especially when I asked. Nana Rose paused, and I could picture her sitting in her worn armchair, the afternoon sun catching the silver in her hair. "Because, sweetheart," she started, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still felt heavy with gravity. "Your mother was protecting you. She was protecting herself. And she was protecting the memory of your father." "Protecting me from what?" I demanded, suddenly furious at this flimsy, outdated excuse. "From the truth that my dad, a known addict, died from an overdose? That's not protection, Nana, that's erasure. I spent years grieving a mystery. I internalized that ambiguity. And what difference does it make? He's still dead." That last part was the core of my anger. What difference does it make? He was gone regardless. But the how mattered. The why mattered. Knowing he succumbed to the disease he fought gave me a path for my grief, a framework for understanding the sadness that permeated our home. Inconclusive was a dead end. An overdose was a tragedy with roots, and those roots deserved acknowledgement. Nana's response was devastating in its simple finality. "Well, it makes a difference to her, honey. When he died, your mother was fragile. She didn't want you thinking that the last memory you had of him, that vacation, was tainted by that kind of ending. She wanted you to remember him as the person who was trying to get better, not the person who failed." And then she added the killer line, the one that cemented the betrayal. "What difference does it make now, though? He's still gone. Let it go, darling. Let your mother have this small piece of peace. Let it go." After 15 years of carefully navigating an emotional minefield based on a half-truth, I couldn't. I physically couldn't. I disconnected from Nana Rose too, not with a slam, but with a stiff, formal, "I need to think." I spent the rest of the evening pacing my small living room, the narrative of my life suddenly edited without my permission. I'm 22.
I've navigated heavy adult conversations since I was 12. I process difficult truths daily. And now, my mother treats me like I'm still 13, incapable of handling the reality that addiction is a chronic disease, capable of winning.
I am furious. I am deeply, profoundly hurt. Not just by the lie, but by the judgment implicit in that lie. The judgment that I couldn't handle the truth. The irony is thick enough to choke on. My family, the ones who shared everything, decided this one pivotal, life-defining fact was too much baggage for me to carry. The silence in my life now is deafening. I haven't spoken to Mum since the call, and Nana has been respectfully quiet. I feel isolated in this new, ugly reality. I look back at the last 15 years, and I wonder how much of my own process, how much of my own inherited trauma was rooted in that unknown variable. I feel like I was finally ready to grieve my father properly, and now I have to grieve the deception alongside him. I want accountability. I want a real apology, not a quick scramble to save face. I want to know why they thought I was so weak. And yet, I see the shadow of my mother's pain, the pain of losing him in such a brutal way, and I hesitate. Am I being dramatic? Am I selfish for wanting to rip open an old wound just so I can tend to it correctly now? Is it selfish to demand that my journey of grief starts when I am ready, not when my mother decides I'm strong enough? I'm so lost, staring at this chasm of deception, not knowing if I should build a bridge back or just burn the whole damn thing down. The next few days were a study in self-inflicted quarantine. I stopped answering non-essential calls. Work became a necessary distraction, the mundane tasks of spreadsheets and deadlines feeling blessedly simple compared to the tectonic shifts happening within my own history. Every time I looked at my phone, I saw my mother's name, and a spike of adrenaline, a mix of anger and preemptive hurt, would shoot through me. I replayed that conversation 1,000 times, dissecting every inflection. That phrase, dropping dead of an overdose. It wasn't just the fact, it was the tone. It was the sound of someone, finally, violently shedding a secret they'd held too long. It confirmed everything the secrecy had hinted at. My dad wasn't a saint. He was a wonderful, complicated man who loved us fiercely. But he wrestled demons that were louder than his love. We all knew he struggled. We knew he disappeared sometimes, reappeared looking haggard, promising things he couldn't keep. But the inconclusive narrative allowed us to believe that ultimately his spirit was stronger than his sickness. The overdose narrative suggested a final, brutal capitulation, and that's where the grief felt twisted. I had processed a sudden heart attack, a natural, albeit tragic, end for someone who might have had underlying issues. That allowed for a sort of dignified closure. But an overdose, that carried shame, and in our family culture where openness was valued, the shame of covering up the cause felt immense. Why couldn't we own that tragedy? Why couldn't we say, he fought a hard battle and this time, the disease won? I kept thinking about my younger brother, Leo. He's 17, he's moody, he's navigating high school politics, and he idolizes our dad in that specific, untouchable way only younger siblings can manage. He knows Dad died on vacation. He knows the story about the inconclusive heart issue. How do I drop this bomb on him? If I tell him, I might shatter the fragile foundation of his own memories of Dad. If I don't, I'm participating in the lie, perpetuating the silence that feels so suffocating to me now. The thought of Leo finding out through some misplaced medical record or an insensitive relative down the line made my stomach turn. My mother hadn't considered him at all in her casual confession to me. She was merely venting about Leo's current behaviour, using the death as a weapon against him in their ongoing spat. That realisation added a sharp, bitter edge to my resentment. My father's legacy was being weaponised in a domestic squabble. I needed to talk to Nana again. Not to seek comfort, but to extract a promise.
I drove over the next afternoon. Her house smelled the same, lavender and old paper, a smell that always felt like safety. She opened the door, her face etched with worry, and immediately pulled me into a hug that felt tighter than usual. "I'm sorry I hung up," I mumbled into her shoulder. "I know, dear heart. Come in. Let's talk without screaming or hanging up." We sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight falling across the worn wooden surface. I laid out the dilemma regarding Leo. "Nana, I can't let this continue. If Mum won't talk to me, I have to talk to Leo. But I can't just blurt it out. He's too young, and honestly, Mum will explode if I bypass her completely." Nana stirred her tea slowly. "She will. And she'll be angry at you, not for telling the truth, but for taking control of the narrative away from her." "I don't care about her anger right now," I admitted, the anger from the first day hardening into resolve. "I care about Leo being kept in the dark. He's closer to Mom right now. They're fighting. If she keeps using Dad's death as this vague, untouchable tragedy to manipulate him, that's inexcusable. He needs context too." Nana leaned forward, her eyes serious. "You have to tell him, yes. But you have to be prepared for the fallout with your mother. She sees this as her burden to carry, and you telling Leo takes that burden away from her, which she will interpret as an attack on her capability as a parent." "So, what's the strategy?" I asked, feeling like a general planning a difficult maneuver. "The strategy," Nana said gently, "is to use the honesty your mother always preached. Go to Leo, not with anger, but with love. Tell him you found something out about Dad, something painful, and that you want to face it together because family faces hard things together. Don't present it as a bombshell. Present it as a shared journey toward understanding your father better." She looked directly at me. "And then you go to your mother. You tell her that Leo knows, or that you plan to tell him, and that you are doing this because you honor your father's memory, and you honor the truth. You tell her you need an apology for the lie, not for the secret itself, but for the way it was managed when you were a child." The idea of confronting my mother with this layered demand felt daunting. It wasn't just about the cause of death anymore. It was about the structural integrity of our entire relationship. Their commitment to honesty was conditional, dependent on their own comfort levels. I left Nana's house feeling marginally clearer, but the emotional exhaustion was setting in. I realized that accepting the truth didn't erase the need for processing the lie. I decided to start with Leo. I invited him over that Friday night, suggesting we just order pizza and watch a terrible movie, making the setting as casual as possible. Leo arrived, all gangly limbs and teenage angst. He was wearing headphones around his neck, a clear sign of his current state of mild annoyance with the world. We settled onto the couch, the pizza box open between us. We talked about school, girls, the usual noise. Then, as the opening credits of the B movie started rolling, I turned off the TV. "Hey, Leo, can we pause this? I need to talk to you about something important. Something about Dad." His face immediately hardened. The casual energy evaporated. He knew this territory. He'd seen me handle these conversations before, the way Mom shut down. "What is it? Did Mum tell you something weird again?" he asked, his tone already defensive, suspicious of Mum's recent mood swings. "No, not about Mum. This is about Dad, and about what we've always been told." I took a deep breath, picturing Nana's calm demeanour. "Do you remember when we were little, and we asked Mum why Dad died, and she said they didn't know? That it was inconclusive?" Leo nodded slowly, fiddling with the crust of his pizza slice. "Yeah, SIDS or something? No, wait, too old for SIDS. Heart thing. Why?" "We were told that because Mom was trying to protect us, Leo. But I found out something else this week. Something that Mom let slip." My voice was low, earnest, trying to convey seriousness without hysteria. "Dad didn't die of an unknown heart issue. He died from an overdose." The silence that followed was devastating. Leo didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the frozen image on the screen. I watched his face cycle through confusion, denial, and then a dawning, terrible recognition.
An overdose, he finally whispered, the word sounding alien coming from his mouth.
Like drugs?
Yes, I confirmed, my own throat tight.
He was an addict, Leo. We knew he struggled, but this is how it ended. He died on that trip to the coast when we were kids.
Leo recoiled slightly, physically pulling away from me on the couch.
No way. Mum said it was his heart. She said he was under so much stress with work, and then his heart just stopped.
I know what she said, I responded gently, leaning toward him.
I believed it for 15 years, but she told me the truth accidentally. I'm sorry, I am so sorry this is coming out now, but I couldn't hold on to this secret when you're still carrying the old one.
Tears welled in his eyes, hot and fast.
He wasn't the teenage facade anymore. He was just my little brother, suddenly robbed of his carefully managed childhood tragedy.
Why would she lie? He asked, his voice cracking.
Why would she lie about that? We talked about addiction. We talked about everything.
I don't know, Leo.
I'm asking the same question. But what I do know is that Dad was sick, and this was the result of that sickness. It doesn't change how much he loved us, and it doesn't change that he was fighting. But we deserve to know the truth about the battle he was fighting.
We sat there for what felt like an eternity.
He didn't cry loudly. It was the quiet, internal devastation of a foundation cracking beneath his feet. He looked at me, searching for reassurance I couldn't fully give.
So, that vacation, he murmured, shaking his head.
It was supposed to be fun.
It was, I insisted, gripping his hand.
And we can still remember the good parts. But now, we also know the hard truth. And we face it together, okay? We face it together.
He nodded,
a small jerky motion, finally squeezing my hand back. That shared moment, that acknowledgement of the painful reality felt like a necessary exorcism. It didn't fix anything, but it brought us onto the same ground.
Then I knew I couldn't wait any longer.
Leo was now in the loop, and my mother needed to understand that the walls she built had been breached, not by malice, but by the sheer weight of time and her own inconsistent narrative.
I picked up my phone and dialed her number.
My heart hammered against my ribs. This was going to be the real confrontation.
The sound of the dial tone was unnervingly steady.
When Mom picked up, her voice was guarded, a thin veneer of politeness masking exhaustion. Hello? Is everything all right? You sounded upset the last time we spoke.
I am not upset, Mum.
I am clear, I corrected, my voice carefully modulated, drawing on the calm I'd borrowed from Nana and the shared vulnerability I'd just experienced with Leo. I need to talk to you about Dad, properly, not while you're venting, and not while I'm hanging up on you.
There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the slight intake of her breath.
She knew this was coming. Okay, she said, resignation heavy in the single syllable. Where are you?
I'm not coming over. I think we need to do this over video call. I need to see your face, and I need you to look at mine. I'll call you in 10 minutes.
Hanging up, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't about drama anymore. This was about setting a boundary for my adult life. I couldn't allow this massive omission to define my relationship with my mother moving forward.
10 minutes later, I was squared away on my laptop.
When her face popped up on the screen, looking tired, her eyes showing the strain of the last few days, I didn't offer a greeting.
Mum, I started, cutting straight to the chase.
Leo knows. Her composure shattered. Her hand flew up instinctively toward her mouth, and her eyes widened in panic. What? How? You promised.
I didn't promise anything, Mum.
I told him the truth that you accidentally told me, I stated firmly. He needed to know, just like I needed to know 15 years ago. The denial phase was short-lived, replaced by a furious defensiveness. You had no right. You had no right to go behind my back with your brother. I am his mother, and this was my decision to manage his grief.
No, Mum. This was my decision to stop participating in a lie that affects both of us.
I pushed back, refusing to let my voice rise, keeping it level and hard. We were raised on the premise that radical honesty was paramount in this family. You are addicted to control, and you used my grief and Leo's right to knowledge as a way to maintain that control.
That is unfair,
she shot back, her voice rising finally. You don't understand what it was like. He was gone. I had 2 children to raise. You were already so sensitive. If I had told you that his relapse killed him on our vacation, you would have associated that trip, that beautiful place, with the moment everything ended.
I leaned into the camera,
my expression unwavering. And what did you associate it with instead? A lie. You forced me to grieve a phantom, Mum. I spent my entire adolescence wondering if I was grieving correctly, if I was sad enough for a heart attack, or if I should be feeling something else entirely. You stripped me of the chance to actually process my father's actual struggle. That is not protection. That is emotional malpractice.
The word malpractice landed heavily.
Her face crumpled. The anger seemed to drain away, leaving behind only raw vulnerability. The vulnerability that usually made me back down. But this time, I held my ground.
I was scared,
she whispered, genuine tears beginning to track down her cheeks. I was so scared that if you knew he died using, you'd think he didn't love us enough to choose sobriety over that final escape. I wanted you to have a perfect father, even if it meant lying about his ending.
I never expected a perfect father, Mum, I said, the anger finally giving way to deep, agonizing sadness.
I expected an honest one. I knew he was imperfect. You told me he was an addict. Why was the ending the part you couldn't handle admitting? If we can talk about the struggle, we should be able to talk about the outcome of that struggle.
I paused,
letting the silence stretch, letting her absorb the full weight of her actions from my perspective. I need you to understand something very clearly, I continued. I am glad I know the truth now. I am relieved that I don't have to carry that uncertainty anymore. But the relief is overshadowed by the betrayal of your secrecy. For 15 years, you kept me emotionally stunted on this one critical point. I need you to acknowledge that. I need you to apologize for lying to me, specifically for prioritizing your version of my peace over my right to the complete story of my own father. She was crying openly now, wiping her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, a gesture so much like the one I saw her use when she was frustrated with Leo.
I'm sorry,
she choked out. I am so sorry. I handled it terribly. I was a scared mother, and I made a selfish choice. I prioritized comfort over truth, and I used you being young as an excuse that has now expired. I'm sorry I kept you from processing his actual fight. I'm sorry, honey. Truly sorry.
The apology wasn't perfect.
It was messy, riddled with justifications for her fear, but it contained the core element I needed, the admission of fault regarding the lie itself. It wasn't the perfect therapeutic monologue I might have dreamed up, but in the context of our chaotic family, it was a monumental shift.
Thank you, Mum, I said,
the tension finally beginning to ease in my shoulders. That means more than you know. We talked for another hour. It was clumsy, painful, and occasionally interrupted by her trying to pivot the conversation back to Leo's behaviour, which I firmly shut down each time. We established that we wouldn't pretend the truth wasn't out, and we would figure out how to support Leo together. The immediate crisis was averted, but the deep work had just begun. The next few weeks were spent navigating this new landscape. Leo and I started talking about Dad in a different context, not as a saint who failed once, but as a man who loved fiercely while battling a devastating illness. It brought a strange closeness between us. We were finally united in the real history. I realized that while I had demanded accountability, the most important thing I gained was the right to grieve accurately. I could now look at my memories of that final vacation, the smell of salt air, the sound of the waves, my dad laughing genuinely, and know that even in his darkest struggle, he was still present, still trying. The tragedy wasn't erased, but the ambiguity was gone, replaced by a sober reality that allowed real healing to start.
But then I started thinking about the bigger picture, the ripple effect of this deception. It made me question everything about how we process life and loss in our family. We value honesty, but we clearly have lines we won't cross for fear of pain. I often sit and wonder about other people. In my own circle, I see friends hiding things, pretending things are fine, keeping up appearances. And I think about my mother's rationale. What difference does it make? He's still dead. Does it ever make a difference? Is there ever a point where the protection of a comfortable lie outweighs the eventual, inevitable reckoning with the truth? For me, it caused 15 years of emotional lag, a delay in my own development of coping mechanisms, all because the narrative was too painful for the adults around me to sustain. So I have to ask you, watching this story unfold, what would you have done when you realized you've been lied to about something so fundamental? Would you have chosen the immediate confrontation I did? Or would you have decided, like my grandmother suggested, that the past is best left settled, even if the settlement was based on fiction? When the truth hurts the people you love, is preserving their immediate comfort more important than your own need for factual reality? I'm genuinely curious to hear your take on where the balance lies in intense family dynamics like these. Let me know in the comments below. And if stories about navigating complex family secrets and the jagged path toward truth resonate with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We have more raw, unfiltered journeys coming your way every week. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation with my mother settled into an uneasy truth. She began the slow, painful work of respecting my boundaries, though it was clear she found the process excruciating. She stopped calling to vent about Leo and started calling to ask direct, specific questions about how I was coping, which felt forced, but at least it was honest engagement. But the hardest part of this whole ordeal, the part that kept me awake staring at the ceiling, wasn't the anger at my mother, or even the shared grief with Leo. It was the lingering question of my father. He was gone, yes, but my perception of him had been drastically altered. I had always carried this image of a man wrestling a beast, sometimes losing, but always getting back up. That was the narrative that fit the inconclusive end. Now, the narrative was different. It was starker, more tragic, perhaps even crueler in its finality. He didn't just relapse. He succumbed entirely, alone on a vacation meant to be a reprieve. I started digging through old boxes in the attic at my parents' house when I visited last month, something I'd avoided for years, as the boxes felt too emotionally charged. I found photo albums from that last trip. We were young. Leo was maybe 2, I was 7. My dad looked happy, tanned, holding me on his shoulders by the ocean. In those pictures, he is vibrant, and the cognitive dissonance hit me like a physical blow. How does a man look that alive, that present, and then, just days later, make the choice, or lose the battle, to overdose? I pulled out some of his old journals that Mom had kept, marked with "do not read" warnings, that I now felt compelled to ignore. His handwriting, usually neat, deteriorated rapidly towards the end of the entries. The themes were clear: the crushing weight of guilt, the promises to Mum that he felt he couldn't keep, and the terrifying realization that the cravings were becoming louder than his love for us. One entry, dated just days before the vacation, stood out. It wasn't about planning to use. It was about a desperate hope for change. This trip. I have to make this trip work. If I can just get enough distance from the city, from the noise, maybe I can hear myself think straight. I look at and she looks at me with such faith. I can't break that faith. I can't afford to fail again. I feel like I'm balancing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind is trying to push me off.
I just need 1 week of solid ground. Reading that, the bitterness I held for the choice of overdose began to soften, replaced by profound, agonizing pity. He wasn't just giving up, he was trying desperately to find solid ground before he lost his footing entirely. His death wasn't a careless end to a happy vacation. It was the tragic culmination of a fight he was losing, even while pretending to win for our sake. This new context changed everything about the grief. The first grief, the inconclusive one, was abstract, terrifyingly random. This new grief was concrete, rooted in the disease, and paradoxically, it felt more intimate. It allowed me to see my father not as a victim of a sudden, mysterious failure, but as a human being trapped in a cycle, whose final moments were likely clouded by desperation, not malice. I realized then that my mother hadn't just lied about the fact of the overdose. She had lied about the nature of his struggle. She had painted his end as a sudden failure, when in reality it seemed he died mid-fight, perhaps even mid-attempt to recover. That realization allowed me to start saying goodbye in a way I never could before. This journey of grief, which I initially felt was delayed and thus selfishly demanded, now felt like a necessary excavation. I had to dig past the superficial story to find the real, complicated, flawed man my father was. The healing didn't come in a sudden flash. It came in small, manageable doses. I started telling people who were close to me, my best friend, my therapist, the truth. Each time I said the words out loud, "My father died of an overdose," it got a little easier to breathe afterwards. It was integrating the truth into my life story, stitching it into the tapestry, rather than leaving a gaping hole where the thread should be. But the most profound shift was in my relationship with Mum, though not in the way I expected. When I apologized to her for demanding accountability in a way that might have shut her down, she surprised me. A few weeks after our video call confrontation, she called me, sounding unusually tentative. "I was looking at some old tax documents today," she said quietly, "and I found the final police report summary from that trip. The one they gave us before they called it inconclusive." My stomach clenched. I braced for another justification, another pivot. "I reread the summary and I realized something," she continued. "The part that really broke me back then wasn't the overdose itself. It was the fact that he was found alone. He didn't reach out to anyone. And I thought, if I told you kids that he died alone, it would feel like he abandoned the family in his final moment. I thought that narrative, the sudden, unexplained loss, was kinder than the reality of him being isolated in his suffering." Hearing her articulate her fear, the fear of him being perceived as abandoning us, was jarring. It wasn't about protecting me from the disease. It was about protecting his image from the stigma of isolation that often accompanies addiction's end stages. "I didn't see it that way," I admitted softly. "I saw the lie as you thinking I was weak. I didn't realize you were trying to protect his memory from the shame you felt he deserved." "I felt immense shame," she confessed. "Shame that I couldn't save him, and shame that I couldn't protect you from the ugly ending. You deserved better handling, sweetheart. You deserved the whole truth, and I owe you that apology, not just for lying, but for how deeply flawed my perspective was back then." This admission, coming from her, the fiercely independent, always right matriarch, was the true turning point. It wasn't just her saying sorry, it was her showing me she understood the impact of her decision, not just the intent. It didn't erase the anger, but it allowed compassion to take root alongside it. We still have jagged edges, but we are finally communicating on a foundation of reality, however painful that reality is. I look at Leo now, and I see a kid who is grieving his father's struggle, not just his absence. He's angry sometimes, but he's talking about it. He asked me to help him find a foundation that supports families dealing with addiction, something he never would have considered before this revelation. The lie nearly cost me my relationship with my mother, and definitely stunted my ability to grieve my father for years. But by forcing the issue, by demanding that my adult self be treated with respect, I accidentally carved out a path for genuine healing for all of us. It was messy, brutal, and frankly, I wouldn't wish that process on anyone. But sometimes the truth demands a sledgehammer.
It makes me wonder how many other truths are hidden in plain sight, buried under layers of protection and kindness in other families. We are so afraid of causing short-term pain that we inflict long-term damage through silence. My father's death was tragic, but the secrecy surrounding it was almost more destructive to those he left behind. It took me until I was 22 to truly start understanding my own history, and that's a heavy burden to carry. The realization that your entire emotional infrastructure was built on shaky ground. But now we get to rebuild, brick by painful brick, together. As the dust settled, the immediate, sharp sting of betrayal began to recede, making room for a duller, more persistent ache, the ache of missed time. I kept thinking about those years between 13 and 22, where I carried the weight of an unknown tragedy, a weight that felt uniquely mine because no one else seemed to share the actual burden of the story. I had been grieving a whole, and now I was grieving a specific, painful event. The strange thing about addiction, which I was learning through painful proximity, is that it warps time and memory. My father, in those last years, was a ghost, even when he was physically present. But the lie cemented him as permanently absent, a man who left abruptly due to medical failure. The truth, while harder to swallow, reinstated him as a man who fought until he couldn't fight anymore. That distinction, that small sliver of his enduring effort, became a crucial part of the closure I desperately needed. I started visiting his grave more often, something I rarely did before, because before it felt like visiting an unsolved mystery. Now I could bring him specific anxieties, specific questions about our family's dynamics, knowing I was talking to the real man, the one who loved us deeply but was also ensnared by his illness. One afternoon I was looking through old family photos with Leo. He was flipping through an album from a Christmas when Dad was sober for about 8 months. Dad was laughing, perfectly present, building a ridiculously complicated Lego castle with Leo. Leo paused on one photo. "He looks happy," Leo said, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "He was," I confirmed. "He was really trying then, Leo. He was fighting really hard." "Mum always made it sound like he just gave up," Leo admitted, tracing the outline of Dad's face in the glossy paper. Hearing that he OD'd, I still hate it, but it makes more sense than just his heart gave out. Because if his heart gave out, that means he was already gone, right? But if he relapsed, that means he was here, trying to stay, and he slipped. That was the key, the shared realization that bound us tighter. The lie had insulated us from the reality of the struggle, suggesting failure was sudden and absolute. The truth exposed the ongoing, messy nature of his battle, and in that exposure, we found a more honest way to honor his memory. My relationship with my mother, however, remained the most fragile structure. We talked, yes, but the air was still charged with the knowledge that I had seen her at her most self-preserving. She respected the boundary, but the underlying tension was visible in her over-eagerness to please, her constant asking if I was doing okay now that the truth was out. It felt like she was walking on eggshells around my newfound emotional fragility, the very fragility she claimed she was protecting me from. One evening, I decided to press this a little further, not to accuse, but to understand the mechanism of secrecy in our family better. "Mum," I started during a scheduled Sunday call, "when you look back now, knowing how much the secret hurt me, and knowing it hurt Leo too now that he knows, do you think you would have handled it differently if you knew you'd be forced to confess it all now?" She sighed deeply, a sound that echoed the weariness Nana Rose had expressed. "It's a terrible cycle, isn't it? You see pain, you want to insulate your children,
You try to manage the narrative to be as gentle as possible. But life isn't gentle, and the gentlest lie often turns out to be the sharpest weapon later on. She paused, gathering her thoughts, and I could hear the shift in her voice from defensive mother to honest adult. I wish I had trusted you sooner. I wish I had trusted both of you enough to face the ugliness of addiction together, rather than trying to shield you from the final chapter. I kept thinking, if I just hold on to this last bit of control, this one perfect memory, I can hold the family together. But honesty is the only real glue, even when it's painful. It was a small epiphany for her, perhaps, but for me, it was permission. Permission to accept that she was flawed, that her love expressed itself sometimes through flawed mechanisms, but that the love itself was real. What this experience solidified for me was the difference between privacy and secrecy. My parents had always operated on a model of radical privacy, sharing everything except the truly shattering truths that they felt would break the recipient. But secrecy, the deliberate concealment of a known fact, breeds isolation. Privacy allows for shared vulnerability. Secrecy forces the receiver into solitary confinement with half-truths. I started applying this understanding to my own life. When a friend was going through a tough breakup, instead of offering platitudes, I offered the raw details of my own past relationship failures, the messy aftermath, the embarrassing mistakes. It wasn't comfortable, but the friend responded with a depth of connection I hadn't experienced before. The shared ugliness created instant intimacy. The finality of this chapter arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, shared moment of remembrance. Leo and I were clearing out some of Dad's old workshop tools. We came across a small, tarnished silver compass he used to carry everywhere. It had been lost for years, a small casualty of the chaos surrounding his death. Leo picked it up. He always said this was his moral compass. Yeah, I murmured, taking it gently. The needle still swung, albeit sluggishly. It probably stopped working around the same time he did. We didn't say anything about overdose or lies. We just sat there, holding this small, tangible piece of him, accepting that his final direction wasn't the one he intended, but that his intentions, his love, his desire to be present were real. We placed the compass on the mantelpiece in the living room, right next to a framed picture of him, laughing on that ill-fated vacation. It wasn't a happy ending. There is no happy ending to an overdose. But it was an honest ending, built on the rubble of a lie, and that was something we could finally build a future upon. The journey was agonizingly slow, marked by resentment and the need to reclaim my own narrative. But the space that opened up, the space previously occupied by the mystery, is now filling with real, authentic memories, flawed and human, just like the man who owned them. I often look back at that Tuesday afternoon when the phone call happened, and I realized that while I was furious at being deceived, the real fight wasn't against my mother. It was a fight to own my own pain. And in that fight, I didn't just learn the truth about my father. I learned the truth about my own capacity to demand respect, even from the people who birthed and raised me. It was the hardest and most necessary confrontation of my young adult life.